1995, Brooks Walker came to People's Church for a year of interim ministry, during which a search committee, with Lynn Foote as chair, started looking for a new settled minister. Brooks loved to play his autoharp and was joined by church members calling themselves the Otto Philharmonic Quintet. We hear him here playing at the start of a Sunday morning service. He also tried his hand at montage making and produced two of them. One was The Sins of Kalamazoo, based on the poem by Carl Sandburg. Brooks took the photographs of contemporary scenes around town, arousing the suspicion of security guards at the Jewel grocery, who challenged him, wanting to know what he was up to. It was Nancy Stone, longtime church member, who read the poem during the montage.
The sins of Kalamazoo are neither scarlet nor crimson. The sins of Kalamazoo are a convict gray, a dishwater drab. And the people who sin the sins of Kalamazoo are neither scarlet nor crimson. They run to drabs and grays. Yes, Kalamazoo is a spot on the map, and the passenger trains stop there, and the factory smokestacks smoke, and the grocery stores are open Saturday nights, and the streets are free for citizens who vote. Main Street there runs through the middle of the town, and there is a dirty post office, and a dirty city hall, and a dirty railroad station. There are hound dogs of bronze on the public square, hound dogs looking far beyond the public square. The trains come in from the east and hoot for the crossings, and buzz away to the Peach Country and Chicago to the west. Or they come from the west and shoot on to the Battle Creek breakfast bazaars. The loafer lagged along and asked, "Do you make guitars here? Do you make boxes the singing wood winds asked to sleep in?" The answer, "We manufacture musical instruments here. Best of all, I have loved your kiddies playing Run Sheep Run and cutting their initials on the ball ground fence. They knew every time I fooled them who was fooled and how. The wishing heart of you I loved, Kalamazoo."
Here is a bit of Brooks' sermon on sin from that day.
My first vivid encounter with sin in another person came when I was in 5th grade. I attended a country school in the Colorado mountains and would walk a mile or so down a country lane or 3/4 of a mile through the woods to the house where we lived. But on this particular day, I decided to take a detour in the opposite direction, down the country lane to the river and back before heading home. I had made it to the river and had started homeward when I heard strange noises coming from a farmyard to the west of the lane. The farmyard, like the house next to it, belonged to the parents of a 4th grade girl. I was the 5th grade, she was the 4th grade, and there were about 5 other kids in the entire school. So I had some sense of identification with the place and the people, though I don't think I'd ever been inside. As I got closer to the house, I could hear a horse pawing the earth and snorting and whinnying, but not the usual kind of horse whinnies. These were the sounds of terror. I could hear the sharp crack, crack, crack of something like a rifle discharging at more or less regular intervals. As I approached the farmyard, I could see my schoolmate's father using a long bullwhip to beat the horse. The animal was desperate, making every effort to escape the confines of the corral. The farmer seemed livid with rage out of his head, swearing and carrying on. I watched for a few minutes unobserved and then made my way home, my heart heavy with sadness. I feel that sadness to this day, and my heart is still heavy whenever I think of that event. This is the first time I've told anybody about it. As a fifth grader, I was shocked by the behavior of that adult neighbor. What could a horse have done to have deserved such treatment? What could such treatment possibly do to make a horse a better animal? Why was the man himself in such a lather? Answers to those questions can never be known. And yet I do know this. I know it well. I know that sin is real and that whatever it is, that man had it, and he had it bad.
By June, the search committee announced that they had found a candidate to invite for a week of meetings with all the various constituencies of the church. And the membership happily voted to invite Davidson Lohr to become our new minister. It was only a month later that we learned that Brooks had been diagnosed with cancer, and he died at the end of that summer of 1986. During the first 5 years of Davidson Lohr's ministry, People's Church was busy, growing, involved, and optimistic. Attendance was so high that even the expanded parking lot was nearly filled, and seats were scarce in the auditorium. Therefore, a second service was instituted at 9 a.m., which featured a more intimate program, with meditation and joys and concerns being expressed, but with a sermon from the 11 o'clock service of the week before. David invented a continuing story which related to the adult theme of the day for the children's moment. In 1991, the Every Member Canvas had 1/3 more families to call on than in the previous year. Here are Diane Warden and Helen Healy, both board members in the era, to tell us some of the other developments during those years.
Well, in terms of the Davidson's earliest years, let's start there. Literally at the last minute, in May of '86, David became available to us. And it didn't take us long to recommend to the congregation that they consider him. So in June, we had that candidating week. It was just like bing, bing. The questions that we had for him and the answers that he gave seemed exactly what we were looking for. With his strengths and his weaknesses, he was a complete package. And his strengths were what I need to talk about. And that is, he was an idea person. Implementing them and diddling with them and doing details, no, he was not it. But idea-wise, we have him to thank for a whole lot that maybe people don't give him credit for. And we got on that trail partially because of one of our interims prior to his coming. Brooks Walker took the initiative when he first came and said, why is it you don't have a ministerial relations committee? Here you're starting a whole new process of getting a settled minister, and it would be useful if you do it now. And so David became the first minister in Peoples to have the support group called what then the Ministerial Relations Committee. He was also the first person in our ministry to suggest some wild ideas that didn't seem wild to him, but he came in and saw what we lacked, and he had no inhibitions about saying, you know, you think you ought to do this, and I think you ought to do that. And to many of those we said, why didn't we think of that before? It sounds like a good idea to us. The photo directory is the easiest one, for instance. We didn't have a photo directory. Now, the fact that he was a portrait photographer might have made a big open hole as far as he was concerned. Well, why don't you have this? He also sort of branched out from just People's Church in Kalamazoo. Over the previous 50 years or more, we were somewhat insular. And I don't know that any of his predecessors said to each other, you know, Fountain Street up in Grand Rapids is doing some really good stuff. Why don't I go up there and see if we can arrange it so that it would be some things that we could do here. And David did that. And he came back with 3 ideas that we've put into practice. Not the least of which is the social justice organization. But that, among many other things, took years to implement.
We had done, in my view, some kinds of social justice things in allowing the kind of open access that we've had to the church all these years, because we have opened up our doors to a gay church. We've had the Jewish synagogue here. We've had gay dances. We've had any number of organizations come in. Divorced Fathers Organization, I don't know what they call it exactly. Just all kinds of organization. In fact, sometime next week, I think it is, the Order of the Mary Magdalene is coming in to use the building for 2 days. So we've always had an open building. And I think in many ways that was our way of providing for social action. That and the fact that as a group, we don't necessarily have a single philosophy of what kinds of things we should be doing in the community. But he did push us, I think, in the right direction.
A couple of the other things that he brought back from Fountain Street is the midweek evening seminar discussion series with university and college faculty. He began with the Joseph Campbell series that not only attracted people from the community, but attracted them enough so that they thought they'd stick around and come on Sunday and see what else we did. So it was a membership growth exercise. But he said, well, why don't you do this? Well, we had never thought of that. Another thing that he promoted, probably, well, I won't say promoted, he grabbed hold of was the cable access possibilities for taping sermons. I'm sure that Jack and Carol Urban were not at all reticent in suggesting this to him, and he immediately went clump. And he said, yeah, that's a great idea. He took that one step farther, and but again, he saw this as something that Fountain Street had done. He loaned his tapes to the Muskegon people, and they put it on cable access. And then it became known within the state organization, the Unitarian Universalist District of Michigan, to have a lending library of sermon tapes. He was looking for ways to involve a very insular community into more of the community, and he found it in many different ways.
Okay. There were several areas that the board was concerned with. One was building and grounds and all of the things that go in with that. The Memorial Garden was completed during that period of time.
I'm Jean Bright, and I'm going to talk about the Memorial Garden. The Memorial Garden was started in 1988 by a group of women, the women's group, and there were several women that thought this would be a good place to start a memorial garden. We could put ashes of people that had died and maybe plant trees. They contacted a landscape architect, and he did a plan. It was approved by the board of directors, and I was delegated to put in the brick walls to put on the plaques, and I did that, and I've been doing it ever since 1988. Esther Christensen's going to talk a little bit about the trees that we have planted.
Well, in the meantime, there have been actually in the whole spread here about 42 trees planted. And these, most of them are memorials to people. But we do have in front a row of crab apples. And they are planted, we call it a celebration row. They are planted in memory or in recognition of people who have done things for our church. And one is for one who was 100 years old, and so on. So we have our memorial trees and our celebration trees. We have some that have become beautiful. We have up here a pin oak, which has grown, and a beech, a purple beech, and another oak, which will be huge trees. And then we have the smaller flowering trees.
This garden was also named after Carolyn Bartlett Crane, who was a minister in 1889. And
98.
she was a very active woman in the community, and so the garden is named in her honor.
The trees are doing beautifully. Almost all of them have lived, except the deer come in once in a while. And we have planted now way up on the hill, and of course there's always room for more trees. And in the fall we have to cut down the wild trees that come in, and also the tall grasses. In the meantime, we have paths mowed so people can view their trees, and on each tree is a name plaque so they know who the tree was planted for, and these are quite weather resistant. And then we also need someone who prunes the trees and protects the trees. There's a lot of work, but I think it'll be beautiful.
We had a lot of issues that dealt with personnel. We had a personnel committee for the first time, was appointed at that time, where we dealt with policies and procedures and so on. Also came up with pay scales and fringe benefits and things of that nature, which we really hadn't had before. And also church organization was all part of that picture.
Part of that focus internally, again, was a byproduct of David's encouraging us to interact more readily with the other people in the denomination. For instance, he not only encouraged people to go to the Midwest Leadership School, which was, I think, at Beloit College the first year. He suggested to the board that we pay their way, that this was an opportunity to develop leadership within the church, and it would behoove us to send people there and learn what they could. What happened, of course, is that two people came back with all these new ideas, including the fact that we had to have a mission statement. But again, if David had not said to us, we ought to hear more about what's going on, those people wouldn't have gone. Who knows how long it would have taken for that kind of change to occur. That change also, people from leadership school also had good ideas as far as conducting our own canvass, the once-a-year canvass. So that was another way in which inadvertently we got drawn into the wider UU community.
A lot of good things were, going back to the organizational structure, a lot of good things came out of that in terms of staff benefits, in terms of thinking through the processes that we use on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis. What we didn't really deal with is kind of our role in community. I think that's one area where David was leading, and there seemed to be some resistance to following. And I think that David served a really pivotal role in moving the church away from 50 years of Ed Palmer and Roger Greeley and their version of what we were, toward a new version, and one that maybe we have defined for ourselves. I don't think the 1 year that we had with Brooks was enough to take us that next step that we had to make. And so I think that he served the church much better than we have thought he did.
He also made a difference in how we appeared in printed materials, whether it was the Gazette or whether it was the UU World. He had articles printed in the Detroit Free Press. He was an excellent speaker, and he took on at least two issues. One was the AIDS issue, in terms of helping the community, that is the Kalamazoo community, put together an AIDS support house, what he called the Rainbow House, as for AIDS patients. He spoke movingly about the AIDS issue in his Sunday sermons. Another one was the many times he was asked to speak by Planned Parenthood or from the steps of the Capitol on Roe versus Wade. And those were very, at least from my reading them up, those were very positive depictions of someone whom we chose as our leader. And he did much to improve our public image.
I had a mentor that I've talked about in other sermons before, an old blind man, an old Lutheran preacher in Chicago, who said that he thought Unitarians were looking for the legitimate heir to God. And while he thought it was a brave search, he could tell that we hadn't found it yet. When someone finds God, said this dear old Lutheran, who could sound a lot like Tolstoy, when someone really finds God or its legitimate heir, it fills them to overflowing, and others are nourished by the overflow. When you find it, he said, you won't have to tell anyone, for then you too will be filled to overflowing, and even an old blind man like me would be able to see it. Jesus could not have said it any better, nor could the prophet Amos. This has been the message of the best prophets in all times, that we are the agents of salvation on this earth, and the measure of the gods we serve, the measure of our own spirits, is the measure to which we have overflowed, have reached out to strangers outside our family, outside of our religion, outside of our race, to share with them the milk of our own human kindness. There are questions not just for me, not just for you, but for all of us, for we really are all in this together. There are questions more profound than answers, and I will end with them. The deepest answers to the questions of life, though, are not given in facts or knowledge or words or stories or sermons. They come through action, through reaching out to reconnect with all of the brothers and sisters we have learned not to see, and offering to those strangers who are ourselves as yet unknown the milk of human kindness. Let us all go seeking peace and wholeness, and eager to pay their price.
By early 1992, tensions had developed centering on Davidson Lure. These only intensified, leading to a traumatic interval at the church, which ended only with David's resignation in March of 1995. 5 members who were deeply involved in these regrettable developments have agreed to explain what transpired. They will each introduce themselves.
1991 to 1994, People's Church struggled with a deep division. This is a difficult time in our history to talk about. It was hard then. It's hard now to recall those events. My name is Drew Kramer. I was part of the board from 1988 to 1991. In 1991, Davidson Lohr began to add some things to our Sunday service, such as prayer and responsive reading, that some people objected to. A lot of our members had spent painful years pulling away from Christian and Jewish orthodoxy, and they asked Davidson to refrain from using some of what was called then God language. Davidson, on the other hand, felt that this was an abusive way to censor his speech and restrict his freedom of the pulpit, and he steadfastly refused to make any changes in the modifications he was making. There were a lot of private conversations, letters written, many phone calls, and still the conflict continued. Pledge Sunday in April of 1993, Davidson responded to this abusive, what he considered abusive ways, by making this statement. He said that his family was no longer safe at People's Church, and that comment was challenged by 2 people in the congregation that day by shouting out. Of course, the pledge drive was compromised, and we decided that a congregational meeting might be the best thing. Congregational meeting was planned for April 24th. People were invited to put their ideas about the conflict down in writing. There were 64 documents submitted. The concerns fell into several categories. One was the additions that Davidson was adding to our Sunday services. Some people felt that the pastoral care was a problem, had experienced some problems there. Some strongly supported David, and they began to think a little bit about splitting the church. And many, just were totally confused about what was going on. That conflict had been private till that moment. And there was anger about the open conflict that was now a part of our lives. The board decided that they needed to do something a bit more formal. So the problem-solving task force was appointed in July of 1993. Marjorie Spradling, myself, were co-chairs. On that committee were David Collins, Ward Greiner, Rick Stallhut, and Roger Wallace. And we were charged by the board to see if we could find what direction the church really wanted to take. We were also asked to develop a code of ethics and behavior and design some communication guidelines. We contacted Reverend Jerry Wright, who was the UU district field rep at the time, and a long-range plan was developed to see just exactly what was at the bottom of our conflict. And we used such vehicles as the forum. There were 50 people attending the forum that morning discussing the conflict. A comprehensive questionnaire was designed and mailed out to 400 people, and 281 people returned that questionnaire completed. That was a 70% response. We held small group meetings. 200 people participated in the small group meetings, a 50% response. And we talked to Davidson Lohr and consulted him about the problems. We found that the congregation respected, accepted, and valued the multi-directional religious preferences that were among us now in the congregation. And we wrote codes of ethics and behavior and communication guidelines. We found that the recommendations that we were offering to the board included: one, that no vote be taken on the split of the church; that religious preferences or differences be discussed in programs such as lay services or forum or adult education or the Life Matters part of the Sunday services. We recommended that the congregation, led by the minister, hold a series of meetings looking at the goals and aspirations of People's Church beyond the conflict. We recommended that the minister seek to expand his sermon topics to other things beyond the religious examination, such as social and ethical and moral issues and political problems and aesthetic themes. And we recommended that the board set up a formal arrangement to examine how we were progressing with solving our conflict. We presented our final report, the Problem Solving Task Force final report, to the board on February 10th, 1994. On February 14th, Davidson Lohr took a 4-month sabbatical. And the stressful undertone continued. By May of 1994, at our annual meeting, there was such discord among us that our then board chair, George Gerritsen, resigned in the middle of the business meeting. And the board now was under great pressure to again do something more. In June, they appointed the Next Steps Committee.
My name is Bill Goodman. I've been a member of People's Church for some 50 years, and during the last half of Davidson Lohr's ministry, I became deeply involved in the effort to get him to leave one way or another. I'm going to refer to my notes a bit because I don't want to get this wrong. I think it's important. But like everyone else at the time, I was captivated by David's sermons. And yet, as warm as he seemed to be from the pulpit, it was very difficult to establish any personal kind of relationship with David. To many, including myself, he seemed somewhat distant and removed. Still, it wasn't until I was elected to the board in 1989 that I actually became personally involved. He had poor working relationships with other staff, and his limited pastoral skills were evident to many, and these became board concerns. And at board meetings, he also was both obstinate and petty when matters affected him personally. One example was at his request, the board agreed to buy a new computer for his personal use. He was accustomed to a Macintosh, and the religious education department and the office were using IBMs, and at that time, those computers were incompatible. Well, anyway, after much disagreeable discussion, he agreed to try an IBM, and he had promised to make every effort to learn it. We agreed to get him a Macintosh if he couldn't. The purchase was made, and at his own admission, he tried it for only one night and then bought a Macintosh at his own expense, which we all knew he couldn't afford. A related example of pettiness involved making copies of his sermons. He refused to make his own typed copy available for recopying, since they had been produced on his own personally paid for computer. From then on, the office had to make copies by laboriously transcribing them from the audio tapes of the service, and this took some 4 to 6 hours of a volunteer's time every week. Sometime during my term on the board, David accelerated his use of God language in his sermons. Probably this didn't bother most newer members, but it ran against a 50-year history omitting language, God language, from the pulpit. And many of the older, long-time members found it very disturbing. I personally didn't care for it. David was aware of this. Now, most of this group felt a discussion with David would be helpful, and for some reason it fell mostly to me to try to arrange such a meeting, and yet, as many times as I tried, he rebuffed every effort. Finally, concern over God language peaked for quite a few people in late 1992. By then, I was president of the Board of Trustees, and on a Sunday after a church service, not as board president, but really as an individual, I approached David and tried to have a conversation with him on the subject. Roger Wallace was with us. I begged David to meet with a small group of concerned members. I explained that we were not trying to limit his speech, but just wanted to be better understood. He adamantly refused and said such people could leave the church if they didn't like it. I was pretty exasperated, and my response was, to say the least, intemperate. And it concluded with these words, which I remember very well: "David, I've had it with you, and if it's the last thing I do in this church, I'm going to get you the hell out of here." From that point on, I became his head alligator. That's what he called us, alligators. I'm not proud of everything I've said or done regarding Davidson Lohr, but neither do I regret the primary thrust of my involvement. I honestly believe he was simply not right for our church. What I am sad about is that so many members I did and still do admire and respect subsequently split off and formed another church. Those are my recollections.
I'm Phyllis Thayer, and I've been a member of People's Church for 33 years. I served on the Board of Trustees from 1989 to 1994, which included a partial replacement term as well as my own full term. In June of 1994, Mark Gernsbach, Phil Kramer, Mary Lewis, Diane Warden, and I were appointed to the Next Step Committee. By that time in 1994, there was a real sense of urgency to resolve the growing conflict between Davidson Lohr and some of the congregation. Our committee was given the task of assessing whether reconciliation was possible and what next steps might be taken. Over the summer, the Next Step Committee met with representatives from the many sides of the conflict, including Davidson, the Problem-Solving Task Force, Davidson's supporters, Davidson's critics, as well as those from the frustrated middle, and the staff. The discussions identified the fact that the conflict with Davidson had become multifaceted. Although some had concerns about how religious language was being used, a major part of the conflict revolved around inappropriate behaviors by Davidson and some of his critics. In conclusion, in August of 1994, the Next Step Committee urged the board to use Davidson's Articles of Understanding, that is, his official contract with the congregation that spelled out congregational expectations, as the criteria for acceptable performance. In addition, we also recommended that the board conduct a formal performance evaluation by January of 1995. This proposal turned out to not be acceptable by Davidson, and he submitted his resignation effective 1 year from that August date of the Next Step Committee report.
My name is Bob Lorman. My family first began attending People's Church in the late 1980s. This was our first experience with the Unitarian Universalist Church, and Davidson Lohr was the first UU minister I'd ever met. Our expectations were soon exceeded. We had found a church home and a community of wonderful friends. I was pleased to be invited to join the board in 1992. Having served on several nonprofit boards in the community, I thought a church board would be a particularly pleasant experience. Unfortunately, it was just the opposite. Until I witnessed a heated exchange between the board president and the minister at my first board meeting, I had no idea there was any unhappiness with Davidson. This was a huge surprise for me because I thought Davidson's sermons were a major strength of the church. As the situation deteriorated over the next few months, I felt very strongly that the relationship could and should be salvaged if everyone would just put their common interests and those of the greater church community first. After all, this was a group of kind, well-educated, tolerant people with a lot of experience in solving problems. As someone who strongly supported Davidson, and as an attorney with skills in bringing people together, I was asked by board leadership to serve on a small committee to meet privately with Davidson and attempt to work through the problem. Our focus was on certain personal traits that many felt overshadowed his professional strengths. While helpful, this effort was not entirely successful. My optimism that common ground could be found gradually waned over the next couple of years after I came to the realization that, one, Davidson could be incredibly stubborn and his own worst enemy when he felt he was right, and two, there was a very small but very influential group of longtime church members who were firmly committed to removing Davidson. It became increasingly more difficult for me to defend or even understand Davidson, as he demonstrated no interest in responding respectfully to his critics. He had little use for diplomacy. His belligerence and undisguised hostility played right into the hands of his detractors and alienated his supporters. Eventually, and unfortunately, the situation deteriorated to the point where everyone, including Davidson, realized that he had to leave People's Church. A death threat personally directed at Davidson at church on a Sunday morning, which I overheard, accelerated the exit process. The cost of the struggle individually and collectively were incalculable. Many people, particularly those who were drawn to the church for the first time during Davidson's early years, simply stopped attending. Some felt that Davidson was being unfairly criticized. Others were simply appalled by the nastiness of the debate. Other members, including many stalwarts of the church, left to organize another UU church in their community. Longtime friendships were strained, if not shattered. My own reaction was to lose interest in becoming attached to any church. It was a personally disturbing and stressful experience. In retrospect, I would have to say that the Davidson-Lohr years were among the best of times and certainly the worst of times for People's Church. Someday we may be able to forget the bad and cherish the good, but even after 10 years, the healing process is not complete.
I am Ray Zelder, a longtime Unitarian and member of People's Church since 1964, when my family and I moved to Kalamazoo. My primary involvement in church functioning has been membership on the Finance Committee, until in the spring of 1994, Deanne Heinz asked me to serve on the Board of Trustees. She contacted me by email since I was visiting our youngest son in Canberra, Australia. She indicated that I was not aligned with either the supporters or the critics of Davidson-Lohr, and that I might serve as a conciliatory force on the board. I was elected board president at the first meeting I attended, as a serving president, George Garrison, had abruptly resigned. As board president, I was a recipient of numerous phone calls and letters expressing both positive and negative views regarding Davidson-Lohr. I tried to listen attentively, to indicate appreciation for learning their attitudes, and to offer clarification if needed. To aid intra-church efforts in resolving the conflict with David, UUA and UDOM were contacted. However, the state and national leadership seemed more willing to offer encouragement and support to a small group wanting to establish a new congregation, rather than to direct their efforts toward trying to keep our congregation intact. Areas of slow growth, such as Kalamazoo, would have benefited from efforts to strengthen a single UU church, not to add an additional one in this area. Many persons, as did I, recognized David's intellectual strength. His sermons were frequently stimulating, his ideas on various issues thoughtful and creative. Yet David also evidenced serious behavior problems and marked difficulties in interaction with people. In August 1994, after calling to say he would be stopping by my home, David abruptly presented me with a written letter of resignation. He submitted his resignation effective August 1995, a year later. I tried without success to persuade him to reconsider his decision. However, after continuing conflict in the congregation, David agreed with the board to leave in March 1995 with full pay through August.